Bob Mueller with a deadline tomorrow for not one, but two guilty former Trump aides, Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen, which means Mueller could reveal details on why he ripped up Manafort's plea deal, because to blow up that deal, Mueller must explain the nature of Manafort's crimes and lies that led to what you might call their legal breakup. And there's no nice way to say this. Manafort was convicted of being a liar, a cheater, and the head of an international financial criminal conspiracy. So really, people already know that. What we don't know is what else he did after all of that stuff that he got convicted for that got his big deal with the special counsel blown up. And then there's this other deadline, 5 p.m. tomorrow, a sentencing recommendation for Michael Cohen. And that involves not only Bob Mueller, who oversaw 70 hours of interviews with Cohen, getting all kinds of intel, but also separate crimes investigated by those prosecutors in New York. And that could be very interesting tomorrow. It could reveal new directions in the whole Mueller probe or in other criminal probes. It could even suggest new names who could be in hot water in the special counsel probe, which is why just about everyone in Washington right now, I can tell you, Republicans and Democrats, partisans, as well as reporters, everyone agreeing basically on one thing. It's time to gear up for Mueller Friday. But I also owe you the facts beyond all that excitement, which is, I have to tell you, it's possible we won't learn any big bombshell information tomorrow. And that is, as you may have seen us do around here, because of this. Mueller might not want us to know the information yet. He might not want us to see it, just like he didn't with these Flynn filings. So Bob Mueller can take any sensitive information he wants, and he can redact it or he can submit it under seal. So yes, I want to be clear, the excitement that you're hearing right now is real. A lot of people, as I just mentioned, are excited to find out what's going to be in these filings tomorrow, and it could be a lot and it could be public, but no, it doesn't mean that anything must be revealed, because Mueller doesn't have to reveal anything sensitive. He can always show it to the judge to prove his case without showing it to us. Now, with that in mind, think about where the White House is at. New reporting tonight, they have no plan for how to handle the next stage of this, with leaks that they aren't even putting together even a draft plan that Trump sometimes rips up. One aide explaining their approach now is more like, Jesus, take the wheel, but scarier. Take from that what you will. New reporting from The Atlantic. And then a piece of international news that's also relevant. Ecuador's president today signaling that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange could actually be extradited to the United States. That obviously ties in with a lot of other loose ends that Bob Mueller is probing. Let me bring in former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, former chief spokesman for the DOJ under the Obama administration, Matt Miller, and Astrid Herndon, a national political reporter for the New York Times, who's been covering a lot of this. Matt Miller, your view as someone right at the intersection. Tomorrow's one of those days that was your job. What can become public and what the public and the media makes of it, as well as all the rules and ways that Bob Mueller can hold certain things back. How do you view that, and where do you see this going?
You know, Ari, I think you're right, what you alluded to a minute ago. I think we will be, once again, kind of reading between the redactions tomorrow. But there are a couple things I think we can hope to find out. One, in the New York filing, I'm actually most interested to see what the Southern District of New York has to say about Michael Cohen's cooperation. Remember, a few months ago, in August, Michael Cohen stood up in court and said the President of the United States directed him to commit a crime and that they violated campaign finance regulations tomorrow. So we don't know what's happening with that investigation since then. We know it's ongoing, and I hope we'll find out tomorrow how significant Cohen's cooperation has been in that case and the extent to which it's ongoing. And then in the other filing, in the Manafort filing, I think the critical question is, what were the lies that he committed? Were they just, related to his own personal financial dealings? Were they related to his lobbying business? Or was there some secret related to the president that he was trying to protect? If it's the latter, I think we'll see it redacted. If it's the former, I think we'll see it completely open because it doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the investigation. I think that's a big question we should be looking for.
That is very big. I'm going to go back to you on it, and then Joyce, your view is, if the lies relate to something that brings in Michael Cohen and these other dealings we've been hearing so much about, that's the kind of thing that Mueller may show to the judge to say, hey, these are big lies, but not show to us.
Yeah, I think so, because if it relates to a lie involving the president, his campaign, and the aspect of the Russia investigation, that's most likely something that Mueller is still investigating, and he won't want the public to know about it. But more importantly, he won't want the president and any other witnesses or subjects to know that. That said, if he gets it in front of the judge, under seal, I think there is something important about these filings, that getting them out of the executive branch and into the hands of an independent judge, if the investigation ever is shut down or ended, there's someone else outside the executive branch who has the ability and the authority to make all of it public.
Joyce?
So I think Matt's exactly right about this. From a prosecutor's point of view, you're hesitant to share information about your ongoing investigations in the public. And that's not because you're trying to keep it concealed. It's not because you're trying to disappoint people. It's because you want the investigations to get to their conclusion. You want all of the evidence that's out there to get into your hands. And for instance, if people become aware that they're investigated, or if people learn precisely where you're headed, it can become more difficult to acquire that information. It can even become dangerous for investigators. So you'll see prosecutors, until everything is complete, hold on to it very tightly. And then there's a second layer of that. Information that you obtain through the grand jury can't just be released willy-nilly. It's very tightly constrained until it becomes used in court or in certain other situations. So prosecutors have to hold that very closely. I'm afraid that that's what we'll see tomorrow. It may be disappointing. Mueller has been much more... Are you afraid,
Joyce, are you afraid as a news consumer who wants more exciting news tomorrow? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think for us news consumers, it may not be great. He's been a lot more forthcoming, I think, in indictments than in these sorts of ancillary pleadings.
Right, because I would imagine the other side of you, and we're happy. We're very happy at MSNBC to have you so interested in interesting news days. I imagine the prosecutor side of you would be perfectly comfortable with that, because it may be the most judicious way for him to proceed.
Absolutely. The prosecutor's side of me is still at war with Matt, telling Matt, you can't reveal any information in my cases to the public. And Matt's saying, come on, just a little bit.
Astrid, I want to ask you your view of all of the above, plus take a look at Rudy Giuliani, speaking as he does in a manner that's so odd about his client. I don't know why he said this, but I'll show you what he says now tonight. Quote, answering these questions from Mueller for Trump was a nightmare. It took him about 3 weeks to do what would normally take 2 days.
I mean, I think I agree with the others on the question of the filings tomorrow. We have seen the special counsel kind of prioritize these indictments over the, the plea filings. And so we may not have the kind of bombshell evening that many of us have been hoping for, especially from a news side. And I think that we've seen the special counsel be really judicious in what he reveals to the public. And I expect that probably to continue on this question of the president's lawyer. I mean, Rudy Giuliani has said so many statements to try to litigate this through the public. I mean, this seems like another one in which we don't really know what to make of it. You have the president himself had said previously that, it was no problem for him to answer these questions, that he did it all himself. Now we have his president's lawyer saying that it was a nightmare for him and it took three weeks. What that means, I mean, it's kind of unclear, because as we've seen previously, Giuliani has often attempted to posture through the media, and that has always come into daylight with the president himself. And so just because the president's lawyer is saying one thing, we don't know, number one, sometimes we don't know how accurate that is, and then other times we don't know if that reflects the president's personal views, and we can get a total opposite thing come a tweet tomorrow. Right.
Well, and Astrid, on that, I'm going to give you a little more for your analysis, and you report for the New York Times, which is known as a very careful publication. You don't use the L word, lie, liberally. You don't just throw out big attacks on folks without the evidence. And here's a little more of Rudy, and he sounds like he's being candid. I don't know if he's being fake candid or not. But when you look at everything that's happened, he says, quote, this is in the reporting, the president's devoted much energy to following Manafort's case rather than prepping for the expected full Mueller report. Quote, the thing that upsets POTUS the most is the treatment of Manafort, Giuliani said. I wonder how, as an objective journalist, you view that statement, because Paul Manafort is someone that previously Trump himself has tried to minimize. Not, I care so much about how he's treated, but he only worked for me briefly. He was out in it for himself, et cetera.
Yeah, I think this actually squares with some of the statements we've seen from the president in the past. When I hear that, I think about how the president has at times used his Twitter account to encourage people like Manafort or Roger Stone, who have kind of defied the special counsel and other investigators, and he has prized their quote-unquote guts or loyalty, while at times he has derided people like Michael Cohen, who are said to have worked more closely with the special counsel. And so this, to me, seems like another example of that, where the president and those around him are giving kind of a thumbs up to those who stay kind of at arm's length from the special counsel, and saying that the president, that is behavior that he's admired, and he said that himself.
Right. Matt, I want to bring you in on the other piece of this that I mentioned briefly in our top. A lot of different things happening, but Ecuador signaling in any way that Assange might actually get prosecuted somewhere is a shift, and it obviously comes at a fascinating time. And there's a wide and long-running debate over whether WikiLeaks, as a normal publishing outfit, should be prosecuted for anything. And then there's this narrower debate over whether at some point WikiLeaks or people involved in WikiLeaks did something that looked more like state action on behalf of Russia. And that brings us to a person named Ted Malloch, who's not a household name, but who was actually the person that Jerome Corsi reached out to try to get to WikiLeaks for Roger Stone. And here is new reporting from The Guardian, which is close to some of this British line of reporting, saying basically Mullers investigators have now asked Malloch, this academic, about his frequent appearances on RT, which has a close relationship with WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Matt, do you see this as a place where Mueller may actually be finding a crime, or he's just trying to get the ducks in a row of all these different people around WikiLeaks?
I think there's potentially something here. Look, this might be the links in the chain that we haven't yet been able to see. We know that on August 2nd, Jerome Corsi told Roger Stone the timing, rough timing in October, and the content related to Podesta of the upcoming WikiLeaks dump. We don't know where Jerome Corsi got that information. He says, and he told you, of course, that he kind of he came up with that on his own in the plane. I don't think anyone believes him.
Well, Matt, hold on. Matt, in fairness, he said on this program that it was a kind of a, quote, divine intervention. On a flight with his wife for the 25th anniversary, it came to him, and then he knew it. And I just want to put that on the record as a serious claim.
Fair. So maybe that's a better claim to a better claim to reality. So back in the real world, we don't know where he got it. We don't know where he got it from, but we know that Ted Malloch was the person that he was going to reach out to, it seems, or did reach out to. He says he didn't get an answer. And The Guardian now says that Ted Malloch who was frequently on RT, who talked to RT, that RT went that very day to the embassy and interviewed Assange. So this is a lot of speculation. We don't know, but you can see where the link would be, which is from Assange to RT to Ted Malloch to Corsi to Stone, and then maybe to the president or maybe someone around the step. What we don't know, and what the prosecutor, what Mueller's team will obviously be trying to put together, is every link of that chain, interviewing everyone involved. And we know they've interviewed a number of them, Corsi and Malloch, and trying to see whether they can put that together. And obviously, if they can ever get their hands on Assange, if he's indicted, or it seems to be that he is indicted, if he's extradited, they can threaten him with charges and try, probably a long shot, but try to get him to cooperate as well.
And while I got you, did your old boss, Eric Holder, think there was a good case to indict Assange at that point in history?
I should probably just talk about what the department did. And the department, didn't indict him. There were no charges unsealed at the time, and it was always.
Are you hearing this? He's going into full spokesman mode.
I will make it. It was always.
I'm sorry I asked.
On the 2010 case, which was just about publishing a leak from someone who could claim to be a whistleblower, it was very hard to see how the department could make a charge against him.
I think the Obama administration was.
Since then,
quite clearly skeptical.
Yeah, it looks a lot more like espionage and looks a lot more like participating in a hack than it does publishing information from a whistleblower. Right,
and we have to see where that evidence goes. I think it's important for everyone to remember, especially in this fever pitch, why a lot of responsible prosecutors and attorneys didn't think there was that case. We have to see where the evidence is, but the idea of turning Julian Assange strictly into a villain because of recent events legally doesn't hold water unless the facts change. Stay with me. I want to bring in Congressman Joaquin Castro, who serves on the Intelligence Committee. I appreciate you making time on a busy night on Mueller Friday Eve, sir. What do you think is important out of all the different things that have emerged today?
Well, I do think that tomorrow is going to be very important. I feel as though that we are going to have more leads and a better understanding, really in 3 categories: on collusion, on obstruction of justice, and on money laundering issues as it relates to President Trump and the people in his orbit. I don't know, none of us know how much of that is going to be redacted based on what we've seen already. Probably a good bit, but I think that we'll come out of tomorrow with a better sense of where Mueller is going, who else may be in jeopardy of prosecution, and which strains of these things, which of those 3 buckets basically present the most danger for the president and his people.
And in the very sort of technical area of inter-branch investigations, which frankly a lot of people don't think about all that often, what is your view of what Mueller has done here? Because there is some sort of quiet or careful communication between his Russia probe and the congressional ones, but now we seem to have passed a turning point where for the first time Bob Mueller has used lies to your institution as a matter to prosecute.
Yeah, and I think that the Michael Cohen situation on lying to Congress was really just the tip of the iceberg. I'll tell you right now that Roger Stone, I'm almost certain, will be prosecuted for lying to the House Intelligence Committee. In the same sitting, he first said to Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell that he had no advanced knowledge of the email dumps, and then when I followed up a few hours later, he admitted that he did. So he basically gave us both sides of that answer while we were in the committee room.
I haven't heard you go that far before. You're saying tonight you think there is already written record evidence that Roger Stone criminally perjured himself in testimony before your committee?
Yes, absolutely.
And do you have knowledge of how the Mueller probe would deal with that?
Well, I assume that at some point they will bring forward that charge and then whatever else they may be charging Roger Stone with. But I will say, Ari, if there is nothing else to charge Roger Stone with, he certainly lied to our committee.
Joyce, what do you think about that?
So it's interesting when you compare transcripts. Sometimes prosecutors are very hesitant to charge someone who clarifies their testimony in the same sitting where they say something that's false. This will turn on the details, and if he's clarifying the earlier comments, he may get away with it. If he's told 2 different stories, both under oath to the same sitting body, he's in trouble. And I would certainly defer to the congressman who was sitting there and heard him do it.
Very interesting stuff. Final word, Congressman.
No, I think that's right. But, you know, and everybody, I think, after January or in January will have a chance to read the transcript. But when you compare those 2 answers, at least for me in that room, and I think everybody in that room had the sense that this gentleman had perjured himself that day.
Fascinating, and as I say, from you, Congressman Castro, farther than at least I've heard. Joyce Vance, Matt Miller, and Astrid Herndon, thanks all for your analysis tonight. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.